why do we do it? It's supposed to be entertaining, it's supposed to be an escapism thing. I completely agree with them. People who are like, why do we need to spend all this energy? This is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be something we enjoy and relax. My thing is I agree, but people of color or marginalized groups have not been able to sit back and relax and enjoy those things in the same way, because see someone on stage, we're triggered and it's not enjoyable for us. When we're not aware, there are plenty of shows that we know and love that have little things that make us uncomfortable. Because I care about it, it makes it easier for me to see where we lack. Imagine a day where we could be better.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Care So Much. I am so excited about today's guest. I am talking to Brianna Fallon. She is a theater artist and anti-racist advocate, and today we're going to be talking about anti-racism and the theater. She has a lot of really amazing TikToks about that and works in theater herself. So without further ado, I'm going to throw it on over to Brianna.
Yes, theater artist. That contains a bunch of things. I like to wear lots of hats in theater. I think the main things that I do are theater education and directing, but I also perform and I write plays and I do sound design, do some light production management. So I like to do a little bit of everything. Anti-racist advocate. It has been so fun finding a place where I actually accept that title and operate in that space. I'm a person of color. I'm biracial. I'm Black and white and Indigenous. I'm a part of the Arapaho tribe. Growing up doing theater has really made you learn some tough lessons, especially as theater really starts to kind of migrate out of the show must go on, mentality, and we're trying to adapt self-care and equitable pay and stuff like that. The longer I do it, the more important these things start to become to me. I'm 31, learning. I've always known that racism was a thing. Growing up, my mom was first off, my mom, she was white, but she identified so much in her indigenous culture because she grew up on a reservation. She grew up on a Navajo reservation. She spoke Navajo, but we're Arapaho. And so she was always don't talk to the cops, and very aware that racism was a thing. And I just always sort of thought of it as this thing that was okay, yeah, there were slaves a long time ago, but it's been very enlightening and terrifying and interesting learning about how all of that stuff still really deeply impacts everything we do today, especially theater, which is what I do for a living.
I think there's a lot of different ways that people can talk about anti-racism and how it affects their lives and how we can approach that in a lot of different things within the theater as well. But I'm very curious to kind of start out, how did you get involved in theater? How did theater become something you cared a lot about and where you spend your time and energy?
I have kind of a similar story to a lot of people about finding interest in it very young. I was in elementary school and we used to do these little they call them talent shows, but they weren't we weren't coming up with our own things. Teachers would create an act and you could sign up to be a part of it. And I loved doing those. And my mom signed me up for a drama class at my church, and I got to do the little nativity story. I got to be one of the shepherds. I loved it. And when I got to junior high, on the first day of junior high, they did this, what's it like going from elementary to junior high? And they did this little play that was here are the things that are different. And it was funny. And I'm oh man, next year I'm going to do that play for all the people who are coming to junior high. I didn't, but every time I watch something, I was oh man, I want to do that. I want to be up on stage in front of people and talking. And I grew up singing. My mom was a really great singer. I grew up singing in karaoke bars. So performing was also always something I enjoyed. I didn't really get to do a bunch of youth theater. I have so many friends who are in all these companies I work for. They're yeah, I went through Spotlight Youth Theater. Yeah, I went through Actors Youth Theater. And me, I didn't get to do any of it. Really, all of the education that I got and opportunities I had was through the public school system. I didn't actually get to start taking classes until I went to high school. Until I got to high school, I did theater there, studied theater in college. And by that time, once I had a couple years under my belt of acting and theater education, then I had enough to just start doing stuff. So it's been about a decade or so, and I've just been doing theater. For me, it's never like this dream and I'm going to be on Broadway and I'm going to, I'm going to be a star. I just like doing it. And I love, even a lot of my videos are about community theater. I love like what people do in their own communities. Still doing it. I work full time doing theater and I love it.
I know from your videos that you do both the on stage and kind of behind the scenes, and even you're a director sometimes. So, what are some of the different things kind of within theater that you do?
So, I make a lot of my income through theater education. My day job is I work for a TYA theater, which stands for Theater for Young Audiences, which is not the same as a youth theater. So, youth theater is like a theater where all of the performers are children. Most of the time they do anything. Like they'll do like Annie or they'll do like Spring Awakening, which is like a more like rated R performance. But a TYA theater it could be children performers, but my particular theater is a professional one. So all the performers are adults. They're paid professionals, but the content is for young people. That's the company I work for, and I manage the academy, which are all the classes that happen on campus, but none of those kiddos perform in our productions necessarily. We have our own little things that we do. That's what I do from my 9 to 5. I accept a lot of teaching artist contracts. So that's usually like 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 or 10 weeks. I mostly teach music theater because that's bread and butter of any like studio or theater company. But I also teach acting classes. I also direct youth productions and grown-up productions as well. I get to write things here and there. A couple years ago, I wrote a show called Emmett's Art Project, which was actually a big moment for me in my pursuit of anti-racism because I was contracted to write a play about anti-racism for young people. And so that's how Emmett's Art Project was created. And ever since then, I've been very outspoken, and this was in 2020. Been very outspoken about my thoughts on how those things coincide together. So, and I performed too. My most recent show, I was Sour Kangaroo and Seussical. I do a little bit of everything.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier is accepting the idea of anti-racist advocate. And I'm really curious about kind of how you started becoming passionate about anti-racism in the theater, and how specifically that idea of like accepting the title of an anti-racist activist was, it sounds like maybe not super easy to do.
As I've talked with people in my community, I'm not the only one who feels this way, but I feel like a lot of people think they have to have some letters after their name or some type of degree or having studied in a more collegiate level what racism is and how that pertains to us. Like I said, growing up, I've always been really aware that racism was a thing, but I sort of saw it as like one thing, right? It's like calling people racial slurs or like not liking people because of the color of their skin. In some of my college classes, like learning, I was like a turning moment for me was like I took a sociology 101 class and learning about like job interviews and how people who are hiring people tend to want to hire people who are like them, and not like a way that we would consider like in your face racism. Like, right, I don't want to hire this person because they're Black. It was more like, oh, I play tennis and this person plays tennis. We have something in common, like I like going dancing at the country bar. This person likes going dancing at the country bar. And, learning that, I'm like, yeah, there are some things that different cultures and races tend to like, right? Like it's pretty common that people of color like hip hop music, and it's not completely unheard of when white people don't like hip hop music. And understanding that while that person's like, oh, no, 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 I'm not racist, I don't mind Black people, but showing internal favor towards people who are like them. And that was just like my first little step into realizing that racism was this way more complex, historical, deeper thing, especially how that pertained to theater. In learning that in college, because I studied theater in college, when we start talking about theater, we always start with the Greeks. And we go from Greek theater to Italian theater. And then we go from Italian theater to sometimes like Spanish theater. And then we get to America. And then, We start talking about vaudeville, starting in this basis of white people created theater, which is just not true. It's there, every culture you can imagine has some form of theater, but we herald like white creating European created theater as like the thing. And what's the most problematic thing I find about that is that through this through line, not always, but very often, was those people were very racist, right? Those people did see
Yeah.
people of color, second class humans. And so as they told their stories and as they created these techniques, they specifically excluded other cultures
Mm-hmm.
and people of color. And we adopted those in modern day. And those are the hallmarks of theater that we herald. Like every theater education department in college will learn about Greek theater. How many are going to learn about African theater or about Japanese
Mm-hmm.
theater? And I started to ask questions and I started to care about that. It kind of hurt that people would start to be like, okay, well, you're just trying to stir things up. You're just trying, like,
Mm.
you're like, we aren't racist anymore. Like, it's 20 whatever, 2010 at the time, 2012 at the time. Like, there's like racism isn't really that much of a problem anymore. And I started to realize, well, it's not a problem for you, right? Because you fit that
Yeah.
ideal vein that theater is like so leaning towards today. You fit that thing. So coming to that realization that I started to read and I started to listen and I started to listen to other people of color. I started gaining information and just learning that little bit. There are so many people who don't know that, right? They don't
Yeah.
understand that why the fact that we teach Greek theater so prevalently, it can be a problem. I think I just got to the point where I was like, you know what? I think I know a lot more based on experience and based on research than your average theater goer, than your average theater person. I also learned, and anybody can be an activist. It just means that it's
Yeah.
something that you're open and caring about. And I don't have all the answers, but I'm learning and I do appreciate sharing that stuff.
So connected to a few of the other guests that I've actually talked to as well, which is the idea of feeling like in order to be an anti-racist activist, in order to be someone who speaks on this topic, you have to have letters after your name versus having lived experience. It's something that particularly I just talked to Carlos Dillard about on our episode on adoption and foster care. He spoke a lot about the idea that despite the fact he has all of this experience as somebody who was in the foster care system, has done all of this research on it, and he now teaches classes on it, people are still trying to invalidate that. And it's something that I've heard in a few different spaces. I think in general that we believe experts more than we believe people's lived experience.
I think there is so much space for both. And I know that's like kind of cliche to be like,
Mm-hmm.
I have this thing like where people, their answer to everything is, well, it's just a balance,
Mm-hmm.
it's just a balance. But I do think there's so much good from coming from like a learned experience and so much to come from a firsthand experience. I think one thing that marginalized people have is they have the circumstances to ask why something is
Mm-hmm.
happening because it's happening to them or it's happening around them. Like, I've definitely talked to people when I was directing Emmett's Art Project. Two of the actors were adults, and one was a Black woman, and we went around sharing, and like the question was like, how has racism impacted your life? And her answer was, I've never experienced racism. Like I've always been I've had like a good life and I'm like really blessed. Not every person feels
Mm-hmm.
that like, oh, woe is me. Why do I
Mm-hmm.
have to be a brown person? In those situations, I think that's why it meant so much to me is because I'm like, I don't understand why I'm always cast a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Like other people get to do so much more different
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And you could come from the outside and be like, well, actually, the reason why you're always cast this way is because you're not very good. Or,
Mm-hmm.
you can come up with this stuff, which, that could be true. You know, it's always hard for me as a director too, when people say, like, this place is racist because they didn't cast me. And I'm like, I'm not saying that's not
Yeah.
true. But as a director, there's so many reasons why we do and do not cast people. And I would say almost 0% of the time, is it because I don't like
Mm-hmm.
somebody? It's like, if you're the best part for the role, you're getting cast. But I think just knowing that this stuff exists, I can tell you of racist things that has happened to
Mm-hmm.
me. I think experts, what they bring is they do bring that why.
Mm-hmm.
Why does this happen? They have data and research to back it up. And I don't really think it behooves anybody to say that experts are more right or people with firsthand knowledge are more right. And I think we need that two-prong approach to the topic. I think it's also important to hear testimony, right, of what's happened.
Mm-hmm.
That's why Emmett's Art Project was a big spur in the show, is the death of George Floyd. And that's testimony. When you hear that story, you are sad. Any person with a heart would be sad about that story. That sadness is what sparks action. People who are researched, they can come in and goodness, I forget the name of the writer, but he wrote the book. He wrote the book on anti-racism. It's like Ibram X Kendi.
We can put that in the link in the description of the episode as well.
He wrote a book on anti-racism. So we who are like, man, I feel so sad about what happened with George Floyd and I hate that happens. I now have motivation to be a part of the solution.
Mm-hmm.
What can I do? And then we can read books like that, and you can watch my TikTok videos,
mm-hmm.
and you can get some more concrete, practical things that you can do to be the solution.
The reason I get most intrigued by talking to people about their lived experience is because I grew up in a family chock-a-block full of engineers. Both of my parents are engineers. My gut instinct is always to go to, you have to prove that to me. And it has been a journey for me to realize that sometimes you have to talk to somebody who's experienced the thing, and then data will back them up potentially in the future. But often the first people to notice something is the people who are like, something felt off to me in that audition room. I cannot tell you what it is. And my experience of it has primarily been sexism, because obviously as a white woman, I'm not going to notice and experience racism. But
yeah, and the main thing to take away for people who are racism naysayers is that the institution
mm-hmm.
a theater was not designed for women. It was not designed for people of color. It was designed for white men. When white men couldn't find the people they needed to tell their story, they would don that, right? They'd do blackface or they'd dress as women and they'd caricature women and people of color. Probably the second time I got cast as a character named Mammy, and I was like, I never thought that this would be a thing. I just thought if you were good, you got to play the character you wanted. Growing up and doing the small amount of theater I did in high school, I was kind of a big fish in a small pond, and I did get the parts that I wanted. And coming to college, I just never thought that people really cared about, I'm 6 feet tall, I'm 250 pounds. I never thought people really cared about the fact that I'm taller than the boys or anything like that. But then I'm like, I keep getting cast as mom characters or caretaking characters. That's when I learned how harsh types can be. Some situations it works in my favor, right? Like when I got cast as Sour Kangaroo, it's a black-coded character. I've talked about it a few times on my channel because it's one of the most recent parts I've played. They're like, we need a black woman who can belt. And I was like, ding, 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 that's me. And same, I got cast as Dragon in Shrek, which I've learned those are basically the same character. So literally the same character. They both have literally both of them have Aretha Franklin riff's title song, and they're bad guys, and they appear for their 5-minute song and then they leave forever basically. So yeah, sometimes I'm like, well, at least I get a nice part because of my type. But yeah, I could talk forever about types and how we should handle it. It hurts having to come to terms with that I am boxed in a way that I don't want to be. And how do you handle that?
There's the how do you handle that, kind of knowing that and feeling that personally. But I think one of the things that you do in your videos is the idea that anti-racism can have these incredibly practical things, particularly in the theater. There's tangible things you can do. Because I think so often when we talk about these ideas of racism, because most people have to start with educating themselves, which it sounds like you did, understanding some of these additional ways that there is this racism within theater. Now you're in this position where you at least understand the problem and you can see these tangible solutions. So what are some of those tangible solutions?
I listened to one of your other podcasts, but someone shared something similar. And I think the biggest hurdle about how do we avoid being racist is that you have to have some understanding of the cultures that are being marginalized. You're never going to be a part of those cultures, and you can be tangent to, but the truth of the matter is, and I learned this from my mom. My mom's white and indigenous. Her mom was white, my grandma. And my mom always told me that my grandma was racist. And I always thought it was weird because I'm like, well, she loves me so much. How could she be racist? But also my mom was a lot more wise and she understood that race isn't just about using racial slurs. But she said that she didn't know anything about Black people until she was related to one, which was me. When she had a grandchild, two, because I'm a twin, my brother, she had two Black grandchildren, she suddenly had a new love and understanding for what that meant, right? She suddenly cared about what we did and she wanted the best for us. And it sort of started to peel off layers of things that she thought that she knew that were wrong and that were messed up. She was not a perfect person. Even the day she died, she was not perfect and she did not understand things. But the point being is my mom always said, she's like, if there's any type of person in your life that you do not like, or you do not, or you have issues towards, God will put someone like that in your life. Now, she was a religious person, but the point that I took from that is you have to care about those people and you have to know those people to understand things. Now, if you're in your bubble and you're like, well, how do I just go up to a Black person and be like, hey, do you want to be my friend so I can learn to be less racist? That's obviously tricky. And so my big thing that I always recommend first is if you care about this is to follow creators, follow people on social media, see the things that they're posting about, see their perspective. When Will Smith slapped Chris Rock, that was a really racially charged thing, and we kind of were like, how do we respond to this? How do we? And I think it's a really good idea to see how Black people are responding to that situation. What are they saying about it? But you won't know that if you're not hearing them. So I have a list of creators that I suggest that are not just Black people, but also disabled people or queer people too. That has been the biggest thing in my life that has given me introspection. What is the word? Introspective into different cultures outside of mine. So that's my big first thing for practicality, is to start to learn what that culture is about. Secondly, and I have some pretty recent videos on this, but it's just to learn the terms, right? And I feel like every time I take some kind of EDI or DEI meeting or test, we always go over the terms and we always go over the same terms. But now the terms that are foundational are now yesterday's news. We know what racism is, we know what diversity is, but there's a lot more terms that different cultures are coming out with, like PWI, for instance. That stands for predominantly white institutions, or HBSU, historically Black college and university, HBCU. DEIA, which is different than EDI, it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So to stay on top of these terms, and the thing is when you follow these people, they will use it, and you'll be like, what the heck is that? I just learned what PWI meant a couple months ago. And because I was in a meeting and they kept using that, I'm like, what is that? I don't understand what that is. But I was around those people and I got to absorb that and I got to learn something new without them having to say, okay, everyone, here's the terms you need to know.
I forget, because I listen to other creators all the time, that sometimes people don't know some of these terms that we might consider foundational. So a term we have used roughly 100,000 times is anti-racism. What does that really mean? And how is that different from some of these other terms that people use? And why is that the one you choose to use?
My foundation sort of comes from the book that I referenced earlier by Ibram X. Kendi, I believe is his name. And in the book, he sort of talks about his belief, which I don't know if is necessarily globally accepted, but his belief is that at all times a person is either being racist or anti-racist, and there's no in between. This active doing something that is that makes it anti-racist. Also, one of the core of anti-racism is largely about policy and not about individuals. It's like policy, not the people, or something. I forget what that is. But it's this idea again, and I honestly I feel like a lot of like people again who are like naysayers about racism would be like on board if they actually understood a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
about it, because it means it's like I'm not blaming you, Joanne. It's like the problems are not your fault.
Yeah.
You're just a product of this system
Mm-hmm.
that is racist. People who are being anti-racist are a lot more interested in policy and shedding light on things than they are calling out specific people. Not that calling out specific people is bad. I think we need to call that stuff out, especially if it gets notoriety. And it's kind of great when people are like, hold on, I don't think it was an accident. We need to that's I think having those stuff is great because then people have to actually think about it,
Mm-hmm.
and they can't just be like, well, racism doesn't in fact impact me. I can just move on with my life, and they have to actually stop and think about things. So yeah, anti-racism for me is being active,
Mm-hmm.
and it's caring a lot more about the policy and the institution of racism rather than just blaming it on the angry white people in our life.
That really resonates with a lot of the conversations I've had in the last few years as well. So I'm from Minneapolis. I live just outside of the Twin Cities. It was a very global conversation. It was also the only thing anyone talked about for a really, really long time here. People who may not be informed with the details, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. That, I think, that has been a conversation I've had with people for many years. I grew up thinking that being colorblind was the right way to solve it, and that if we just stopped seeing racism would go away. You definitely don't notice it if you don't see race, but that doesn't mean it's gone. Learning that myself, and then starting to have conversations with people that so often start with like, listen, I'm not saying you're the problem, fictional straw man character. You're not the problem, Janet. The problem is all of these other things, but those things taught you. Those things are the things that are ingrained in your processes. So you have to basically you have to assume that you've been indoctrinated into racism and that your brain, so you have to actively work against that. And that's how I think of, from what you're talking about, there's absolutely those systemic things, and we can all get behind being against those systemic things, I think. But I also think there's an onus on white people to become aware of what racist lines of thinking look like, because it's not just using particular language. It's not touching Black women's hair is like bare minimum at this point. That is super clear. Like, you should know that. But even just understanding the thing you talked about with job interviews, how important is it for people who are in positions of power to understand their own natural bias, that if somebody golfs, they want to golf with them. And so they think of that person as a better person, and they can't understand why, because you have to then be aware of that and be like, oh, I really enjoyed that interview with Sarah. But the reason I enjoyed that interview with Sarah is because we talked about our experience with trying to ballet for 17 years or something. And it actually has nothing to do with her ability to be an assistant at this company or whatever it is. Ballet was a terrible example for theater, because if you had 17 years of experience in ballet, that would make you more qualified in theater.
Well, I mean, ballet versus what if it was someone with 17 experience worth of pop and locking?
Exactly.
Also a thing. And those definitely those coded things have impact in those conversations.
We've talked about kind of that idea generally of what do we need to think about for anti-racism generally, starting with that idea of understanding what it is, educating yourself on those terms, figuring all of that stuff out. In terms of the practical stuff, specifically, why theater, I guess, is one of the other things that I want to ask within that is I think there's some things that seem inherent about theater. We've talked about the idea of there's racism built into the history of theater, particularly in the way we talk about it in the United States. But why is that something that you feel is particularly relevant and something you're particularly passionate about? Is it because it's where you work, or do you think that there's more to it than that?
Like, one thing to realize is that white supremacy exists in pretty much every institution, because that's how our country was founded on white supremacy, and we benefited off of oppressing people of color, and we benefited off of creating organizations that thrived on their abuse. Those things, we didn't just decide one day, like, let's completely change this, because let's completely change theater because it started off here in America, like doing minstrel shows. Like, we still use the essence of minstrel shows in pretty much every way you can do theater, because that's how it was created. And we just sort of like took the minstrelsy out of it and called it something else, but it's basically the same thing, right? It's this like performance. And I made a video about this too, about how theater, like, why do we do it, right? It's supposed to be entertaining. Like, why do we have movies? Why do we have TV shows? Why do we have books? It's entertainment, right? It's supposed to be like an escapism thing. And I completely agree with that. And so when people who are like, why do we need to spend all this energy? This is supposed to be fun. Like, this is supposed to be not, it doesn't have to be educational. It's just supposed to be something we enjoy and relax. And my thing is I agree, but people of color or marginalized groups have not been able to sit back and relax and enjoy those things in the same way, right? Because when we see something and we see someone on stage and they have white gloves and they're singing, like, doing like the Charleston, we're triggered because we know what that means.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not enjoyable for us in those senses. I'm not saying that's every single thing, but when we're not aware, there are plenty of shows that we know and love that have little things that make us uncomfortable because we know that we're the butt of the joke. So I think that every institution needs advocates for, and not just theater, but people who write books and people who work in nonprofit, people who work with animals. And theater is just the thing that I care about the most. Because I care about it, it makes it easier for me to see where we lack. Imagine a day where we could be better and people could be more included in the conversation. That's why this means so much to me. I don't think it needs to mean so much to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it's different. And even in my script, I write that fighting against racism or being anti-racist doesn't have to be a huge part of everybody's life, but it has to be a small part of everybody's life. Everybody. It has to be a small part of your life. And then there are people like me who will make it a bigger part and pick up the slack there.
People so often, particularly with something like theater, that is an escape for so many people and is the space that's supposed to be joyful and fun. And like, can't you just calm down and enjoy the thing? And I think that point that you mentioned of lots of groups of people have not been able to sit back and enjoy it. And that really in doing this work, this anti-racist work, and in all of these other things that we're talking about, that is to make it so that people can sit back and enjoy the thing. So this work is hard and sometimes traumatic and difficult and painful to do, 10 times, 100 times more painful for the people who are in whatever group it is that you're fighting for, if you're not a part of that group. So always keep that in mind. But I think it's very similar to, I feel like I'm plugging a couple more episodes. I swear it's coming up naturally. But in the episode I did with Joey Clift, where we talked about Prey and why he was so passionate about the movie Prey, and he talked about that idea of he has to make a choice often when there's representation with Native people, which I'm sure you've experienced as well, where you go, okay, I either get to be happy about the fact that I'm getting represented at all, or I am going to have to criticize this because it's playing into this stereotype or that stereotype. And he talked about how joyful it was to get to watch a movie like Prey, where he could just enjoy it. It could just be a good movie with good representation where he felt good about watching it. And I think that the more really like hearing and understanding that, the idea that like you can't go to movies and see yourself in something without having to put that critical lens on. Everyone should get to enjoy that kind of experience. And that should be true in every space. And I think theater's just another space that with some really practical steps, people can can create a space where everybody can find that joy there. If somebody who, let's say somebody who's involved in some level of a theater company right now is hearing this and they're like, great, I actually already knew the term anti-racism. I knew some of this history, but I don't know how to implement this at my organization. What are some of the ways?
The answer to this question is tough because money is usually a thing. And like I said, I talk more about community theater because that's where a lot of the space where I operate. Like we recently did a show here. It was Little Shop. And this isn't the first or last place to do this, but they cast 3 white people as the street urchins in it, which are kind of like the doo-wop singers in it. And everybody in my community was up in arms and like, I can't believe we did this. Like, why didn't, like, these are supposed to be people of color. I guess the script doesn't necessarily have to, but they're coded that way. I certainly thought that they should like postpone the show or something. They did get 3 people of color, but none of them were Black. I don't know if that was the answer. I mean, they did something, but the thing is like, if they would have had a person of color in the room, they would have had somebody there to say like, I noticed that we just cast 3 white women in the role of the street urchins, which are traditionally Black people. And I'm not okay with that. My response is whatever you decide to do to be inclusive and diverse, you have to have a person of color or a person from that community involved in the conversation, which unfortunately means like you have to hire somebody. I am sensitive to the fact that community theaters do not make a lot of money, and a lot of people involved are volunteers, and they're doing this just because they enjoy it. In my opinion, you don't get to get off on being not being anti-racist because you don't have the money to do so. That doesn't mean you just can be like, well, we can't afford to not do this show and offend a bunch of people. So in the past, I've suggested you can, and I do this a lot, is you pay someone for their opinion on something. And that's a good place to start. I've definitely looked up people from different theater companies around the nation and said like, hey, I'd like to pick your brain for an hour. Can I pay you $40 of my own money? I'll Venmo you $40. And I just want to pick your brain and get your opinion on something. And they're always happy to. And the people I've asked they sometimes have like said, you don't have to pay me. But most of the time they're like, hey, thank you for offering and saying that my opinion is valuable and it means something. So there's that. Also, I live in Arizona. 46% of the people who live here are people of color. And so, in my opinion, 46% of the shows that we produce should be representative of that culture. We're probably somewhere close to like 9%. So there's a huge gap to fill. So I think if you're a part of a theater community, especially community theater, look at your community, do the research. I know in Minneapolis, there's a huge is it Somali? There's a huge Somali population. Yep. Right? Like, that would be a really great community engagement thing to like, is there a community center you can partner with and create shows that way? That's like a community response based decision on things. You could still do the Wizard of Oz. You could still do Hello Dolly. I always use Hello Dolly for some reason. You can do Hello Dolly. It just sounds like a super white show. I don't know much about it, but no, I saw it once actually. I remember I saw it in high school and I liked it, but that's always my example.
That's amazing.
You could still do that. And also like I had someone say like, well, I don't think 46%, I don't think all those people come to see theater. And I was like, they don't, because all you're doing is Hello Dolly, right? Like, we're not going to get a 7th grade Black boy to come see Hello Dolly. I'm sorry. I'm like, we can do stuff that they like too. So I would try to set a goal to like partner with different organizations or increase the diversity in your theater company. And then also I would start to make standards in your company that require equity, diversity, inclusion. And for people who are part of the organization to understand that, I've said this in videos too, but you can put a statement on your website of the practical things that you are doing to be more inclusive and to connect with that community. So the big thing is like a group of white people cannot do it on their own. They can't. And if you're looking at your community theater and it's all white people, that is a problem. It's an active problem. And unless you have some type of partner with an organization in your community, or you hire people, or you're paying consultants to come, you're actively creating a problem.
You listed off so many great things that are the counter to one of my least favorite things, which is like, well, I don't know anybody who's not white. It's like, okay, well, let's talk about that a different day. But here are the ways to connect with the idea of like finding a community group to partner with is so fantastic. I love that idea, but being really intentional about it. So I'm going to ask you one of my least favorite questions on earth, and I'm very sorry about it.
That's okay.
Having those standards written and saying we are going to do at least this, and this is going to be our minimum. A response that I have actually heard people say in life is, well, we're just going to cast the best person. We're just going to hire the best person for the job. What is a counter to somebody who says something like that?
Yeah, I've heard this a lot, and I have strong opinions based on it. First, and like just to go back to my previous point, that's all fine and dandy, but if you don't have a person of color who's there to be an advocate, what a person's definition of the best is going to be skewed, especially like a person who is more traditional, right? If they're casting Dorothy, they're looking for someone with brown hair or who can have a brown wig, who has the same stature as who played Dorothy?
Oh my God, I can see her face in my head.
Judy Garland.
Oh,
Judy Garland. Right?
We would have gotten in big trouble. This is going on the internet. We would have gotten in huge trouble.
Judy Garland. But that's what they're looking for, right? And when they see someone who walks in and who can do the voice and who has the range and who can fit the costume, something lights up in them. And they're like, this, it's like a heavenly glow. And you're like, this is the person. Then we'll continue to do Wizard of Oz, and it'll continue to have the same Dorothy. And it'll just be like a regurgitation of this story that we've heard a million times and we'll hear a million times more, done the same way. And then you could do what the theater company did, who cast a plus size Black woman to play Belle in Beauty and the Beast. National coverage. I don't know if this was like a regional theater or a community theater. They got national coverage because they did this, and the actor who played it killed it. It was amazing. It was fun. People were coming from out of town to come see this show, and because we've seen Beauty and the Beast a million times, we know what it is. And I'm not saying it's not good when you have someone who's traditionally fits that role, plays the role to do it. But we need a diverse group of people to come together and make a decision about these types of things. And I think, not just because it's a good thing to do to include diverse people in casting, but because it's interesting. It's fun, when we can see people in these different roles. Like, also, casting the best person as the role is, I don't think it's true, because so many things come into casting. A lot of times people cast their friends, which, to be fair, I'm all for. I'm all for casting people who are friends. I'm all for like actors or directors following you around so they can work with you again and you can keep working with them. But that's a problem when you're a white person and all of those other people are like white, cisgendered, like able-bodied people. I have friends too. I have friends who are like, hey, when's the next show you're gonna direct? Because I want to audition. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm gonna do this show. Maybe I can cast them in this character. I'm doing that stuff already. Obviously, if someone comes to the audition and they're awesome, I think we as humans were too biased. We, especially community theater, we have too much fun.
The point that you made there of that bias, it's so similar to that job interview thing that we were talking about before, where it's like, you don't really know, like, my counter to it anytime somebody says that is like, you're not hiring. Like, if everyone you're hiring for every role ever, if every person you're ever casting is a thin white man, I'm so sorry for you, but there's no way that is always the best person in the room. There's so many things like that I think there's this study. I'll find it and put it in the description, or I won't, and it doesn't exist, but I'm pretty sure this is real. There was some study they did where they started doing blind auditions. So it was an orchestra or something, where like genuinely, like it wasn't, there's arguments to be made that with theater, like you have to see someone, you have to see them acting and all this stuff. Like, this was an orchestra. You literally did not need to see the person. You just needed to be able to listen to the instrument. And they were, it was years and years ago. It was a very old study. So they were specifically talking about the fact that they had only had men in this orchestra before. Women had auditioned, but only men had ever been like actually selected. And they started putting a curtain up so you couldn't see the person who came on stage and auditioned. They still were casting more, they still were putting more men than women. It was corrected a little bit, but it still was significantly biased. And they found out that it was because they could still hear the person coming on stage. So they could hear these women, like their shoes clicking on the stage. So they weren't casting them because they could still tell that they were women. And like, so you have to, like, I always think of those sort of, let's have a bar, let's understand what our community is and make sure that we are trying to cast something that is representative of the community. That's just a correction for your own bias. Like that's something that like this subconscious bias lives inside of you. You have to, I am super conscious in making this show diverse. I do not have the list of previous guests by just inviting my friends to be on. I very intentionally am trying to talk to people who have different experiences than me and that represent different groups from each other and from myself. And I still catch myself doing things where I'm like, that's a problem. Like I have been consciously working against this for years, and I still catch myself doing things all the time. It is catching myself doing those things and choosing to make a different choice, like actively making a different choice. That's why the anti-racism being an action thing. You have to actively combat it, because being passive about it, you'll continue to have all white casts. Tell me about your Emmett's Art Project. I want to know about like what that show is. And if there's ways, like, can people put that on themselves?
Yes, you can definitely license it. It's on New Play Exchange. And it's also on my website. I've had one group who wanted to do like read it in their classroom, like in their theater classroom, and they did that, and that was really exciting. So no one else has produced it yet, but yeah. So Emmett's Art Project, it is about the main character's name is Amira, which I know it's called Emmett's Art Project, but the main character's name is Amira, and I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience as a biracial woman, and also I had like an assistant writer whose name is Abby Yee. She's also biracial. She's white and Asian, and so then the character she kind of centered herself around. Well, there's another character in the show that she centered her personality around, and they're sort of like talking about their experience being biracial and being people of color. But they're high school students. Amira is a part of the art club at her school, which stands for Anti-Racist Teens. They don't actually do art. It's just like a social justice group that she has at her school, but then also in her personal life, she's religious and she's a part of like a Bible study, and she goes to school with these two camps of students. So she's like biracial racially, but then like also kind of politically, like where she has like a conservative sphere of people and a liberal sphere of people. And she feels like kind of caught in between the two communities. And her friend Emmett is also in the same position. He's a Black man, also in the Bible study, also in the art club. And he has a homework assignment. And for his assignment, he decided to spray paint a mural on a wall. And it was late. So he was doing it at nighttime, and he was shot by a police officer, and he's in the hospital. Now Amira, and it was like in response, like the whole beginning part kind of talks about George Floyd. The students are talking about how they feel about it, and Amira feels like she kind of like there's two camps like telling her how she should respond to her best friend, a Black man, being shot by a police officer. Like, I won't give away the ending, but obviously, she kind of finds a balance between the two, and one sort of being like, I need to stand up and do something and be anti-racist instead of just creating an atmosphere of like animosity where she just name calls and cancels people. She invites her friends to learn more about that community, like I was talking about earlier, to educate themselves and teach them that they can also be anti-racist, even though they consider themselves conservative. It's all the actors are teens outside of two characters that are adults. Yeah, there's a protest scene, like we address like MAGA hat guy. It's literally his character is MAGA hat man. Address police brutality. It's a cast of I think like 11 or 12 characters. All of the there's some non-binary characters or like characters that can be either gender, stuff like that. But yeah, I worked with an amazing group of talented teens when I directed the show. Fortunately, we got to record it, so I have like a recording of it with like angles and stuff. But yeah, it's a very touching show. The ending is, I love the ending of it. Not to toot my own horn, but the ending is like really great. It's very touching. And yeah, if you wanted to like, I've had some people just pay me because they wanted to read it in their class as like an educational thing. But if you'd love to perform it, let me know. I'd be happy to license it out to you. But yeah, it was a very special show for me.
It sounds really special. If anybody near me wants to do it, really, honestly, if you do it anywhere in Minnesota, I've got a car, I'll drive. If you do it anywhere in Minnesota, I guarantee at least 2 tickets because I will harangue a friend to come with me. So we'll put links again in the description for how people can access those. I'm assuming people who run community theaters know.
Yes, I promise I'll charge less than MTI and Concord. So just putting that out there.
A very inside theater burn that just happened here. So how can someone in a very friendly way stalk you on the internet?
The main place I post on TikTok, that's more of like stuff I post for the public. My handle is Facilitator of Joy, and which is also my handle for Instagram. And Instagram, I post some of my TikToks there, but that's more about like my life, you know, projects that I'm doing, like where I do actually mention names of theaters that I'm working with because I cut them out most TikToks. Following me on Instagram would be like a great way to see like my day-to-day like opinions about things. TikTok is a lot more of like I'm looking for practical ways that I can engage in theater, and also I have like a series that's on like fair hiring for contractors. So if you like make a contract as a teaching artist or as like a director or, you know, like a sound designer or whatever, stage manager, I have a series that's about ways to make sure you get the money you're owed.
Thank you so much again for coming on. This has been such a blast. I genuinely could talk to you for another like 3 hours. And if you're finding that you could also listen about this for another 3 hours, great follow on TikTok. So go do that and watch all of her videos. That's what I did this morning for like 3 hours. Anybody who is listening to this and going, I'd love some more Care So Much, as I mentioned, this is similar to some things that I talked about in the episode with Carlos Dillard on adoption and foster care. There's also a lot of overlap with the things that I talked to Joey Clift about. Specifically, we talked about Native representation in the movie Prey. So that's a great one to go listen to. And then this is a conversation that is related to a lot of different areas. So I'm sure we'll have more episodes coming up where there's going to be things that we talk about related to anti-racism. But if you want to follow more of Care So Much and see more of the stuff that I do, it's Care So Much Pod across every social you can dream of. And you can find us on all of the podcasting platforms that you enjoy. If you've been enjoying this episode and maybe some of the other episodes, if you want to leave a review, however many stars you feel I've earned, and a sentence or two, it genuinely really helps people find us. If you want to recommend a friend listen to this, if you have friends in the theater or friends who are particularly anti-racist and you think they would enjoy this episode, first, hopefully you have many friends who are anti-racist. This would be a great episode to kind of bring them in on. And if you're out there and you care so much about things and you are really passionate about something that you could talk about for hours and hours, and you feel like you need to be quieter about it because nobody cares, just know that I do. I care so much.